Okay, it is time for another author interview at Crystal Lake, and today our guest is Zachary Ashford, who just released his book, The Morass, Servant of the Fly God. And so tell us a little bit about yourself, what you write, and introduce yourself here.
Okay, awesome. Well, obviously, Zachary Ashford, as you said, predominantly horror, variations of horror. This is probably the most brutal of the horror books I've written, but in the past, I've written. I've got a couple. We have the When the Cicada Stopped Singing was nominated for the Aurealis Award in Australia. It has a sort of nice companion to the Morass. In September, I have Polyphemus is coming out, so that's really exciting. That's my first novel, so I'm hoping that is really cool. Well, obviously it's really cool, but I hope it goes well. And yeah, just basically kind of Oz horror. I've started to think of it as, I like a lot of the Ozploitation stuff, so I think of it as maybe Ozpunk would be a cool way to describe it. And I know there's a few authors doing that kind of thing, so if we get some sort of movement going, that'd be awesome. In my own time, well, in my own time, in my work time, I'm a teacher. I work in high schools, and yeah, freelance writer and all the usual things that writer people do. So that's me.
Okay, so when you started doing the writing, why did you decide to write in the horror genre? What appealed to you about it?
I think I just love it. I've always loved blood and guts kind of stories. Even like when I was a teenager, I used to read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi. I always preferred it when it was, pretty gruesome. And I just love monsters. I think most of my books are kind of creature featurey, or sort of people say, oh, if there's a Zach Ashford book, they expect a monster in there somewhere. And I just love that stuff. It was just natural. I mean, I think like a lot of people who have studied writing, I sort of dabbled with trying to write what I considered literary kind of works, which really were just the whining of, middle-aged white men. And so no one wants to read that. Oh, my dad, blah, 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 blah. So, those kind of things. But horror is just rad. I just love it. Like if I'm going to put a movie on, I'm going to put on a horror movie. If I'm going to, read a book, I'm going to read a horror book. And I just love horror, and I kind of gravitate towards having horrible things happen. On a probably more, on a deeper level, I really love, I think with good horror that you can do things that are kind of related closer to the catharsis of tragedy and tragic, that kind of stuff. So I kind of, the dichotomy, I guess, I really like that kind of Shakespearean, Aristotelian, tragic sort of stories. And I just think horror is a great vehicle for that. Even when I think of, plays like Macbeth or Shakespeare, I think they're not Shakespeare, sorry, Hamlet. I think they're really kind of naturally horror stories, psychological horror stories. There's a supernatural, but there's also the horrible things happening, and I like that about horror. Love that. So yeah, that's what I'm interested in. That's what I write. So
Yeah, there is a horror vein in Shakespeare, and a lot of classical books, in fact, that have a bit of horror in them that people don't seem to realize that a lot of books do
yeah,
have some horror
it's
edges
it's
in them.
really interesting. I think when they were, because I'm a high school teacher, when they were introducing the new curriculum a while back, and one of the other teachers was like, "Why do all of these books have horribly sad endings?" And I'm like, "Well, that's pretty much what stands out in the classics. Even your Great Gatsby's and things like that. It's just like this tragic ending, and it fits the mold of a tragedy really well. Obviously, you have Mice and Men, those kind of books, and yeah. But no, I agree completely. So yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that you like to write the creature features and stuff. Are there any other subgenres of horror you'd like to dabble in?
Yeah, like, yeah, definitely. I think I think it's a skill level as well. I'd love to write a really good psychological horror, but to me that seems like such a more nuanced thing to get it right. So I'm a little bit scared to have a crack at that, because I just think there's a different level of skill and, as I said, nuance involved in writing something that's truly psychological. I think when I think of, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Gift. That's probably one of the scariest movies I think I've saw, just because the implications and the psychological horror of that were just like, oh my God, that is absolutely horrifying. That's scarier than any monster could be. And it's just this really malicious human behavior that, you know, really gets under the skin. And I'd love to write something like that, but I don't know if I have the talent yet. I don't know if I have the subtlety, maybe, in what I'm writing. And there's some really great operators in there. So that's something I'd love to have a crack at for sure. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I find the shorter fiction lends itself easier to writing the psychological horror
Mm.
than the longer fiction, because you have to condense it so much. It's easier to get that tension, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely makes sense. Maybe I should try that.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about your book. So give everybody a quick overview of the book. What's it about?
Okay, so the Morass is at its heart an Australian horror story. It's very Australian. Um, and basically, what you've got is one young girl is trying to write her sort of first kind of manuscript after finishing university. And she decides that her grandfather, who was from the bush, always said, you know, people in the bush get a hard rap because the stereotype of the you know, everyone out there is a backpacker murderer and all this kind of stuff. And so she goes out there to have a look, and unfortunately, she does come across someone who is a backpacker murderer as well as another a young man. So the two of them are abducted by this backpacker murderer. Only it unfolds that he's not just doing it out of some perverse need to kill. He's actually in liege to this cosmic deity that came down millennia ago and is lurking in the swamps or the morass in his vast property behind his home. And that's something that it's become almost folk horror, and that it's become a religion for him. His mother passed it on to him. They knew about this creature there, and it's been manipulating them over many years, and they've been acting as its kind of earthbound minions, I guess, is probably a good way to put it. So that's essentially what the story is about. It's about this idea that we all love to see the best in people, I think, and it's one of those things that horror really helps us think about is, you know, ultimately, like, there is hope, and people are generally good. Like, most people you meet want to do nice things and do those sorts of things. But beyond that, there's, I think, some of our systems and things that are in place aren't so benevolent. And what we kind of find, there's some links there to some bigger things going on that are more subtle, that while people themselves might be inherently good, perhaps organizations aren't. And so there's some of that tied in as well. And yeah, what Katie ends up finding out is that, you know, life isn't always great. So that's it in a gist. For an elevator pitch, I guess you could call it kind of a Wolf Creek story with a bit of Cthulhu. I've heard someone describe it. So cosmic exploitation story. But yeah, it's pretty gruesome and fun. So
Yeah, well, a bit of Cthulhu never hurts anything.
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so what were your inspirations or your reasons for writing the book?
Oh, so I'm going to waffle a little bit here. It goes back to like 10, 12 years ago. I used to work in Rockhampton, which is in central Queensland, where most of the book is set. It's not set in Rockhampton, but further out bush than there. And I was riding a 250 motorbike back to Brisbane, which is a kind of 9-10 hour drive. And it was pretty brutal on the body, that ride. And I left after work one day just thinking, this is going to be pretty cruisy. I got sort of 10 minutes out of that city. The skies opened. There was a huge storm, and I was just soaking wet. By the time I got halfway home, there was this servo. I stopped just to try and warm up, have a feed, you know, get some coffee into me, and just kind of get dry for at least a few minutes. And there was this dude there, and I'd never been so scared in my life. And he was approaching, and he was asking me questions about, you know, what sort of bike I had. He's like, "Oh, where are you going? Who's expecting you?" And these kinds of really ominous questions. And I'll tie in a little bit to that in a second. And sort of all the hackles in the back of my neck, you know, that primitive lizard brain that we have was just going, this guy is not all right. You just need to, like, not engage. And anyway, he sort of asked me about the bike some more. I said, look, it's just a piece of crap. It's nothing amazing. It's just a bike, but I really just want to get warm. And so he went away, and then he actually comes back around the corner after I'd moved, hoping he wouldn't see me again. And he comes back in, and he actually said, "Oh, that bike's a piece of shit." And I was like, "Well, awesome." Like, and by this stage, I was like messaging people like, "This is not a good situation." And I was sure at that point that if my name was Sven and I told him I was backpacking or picking fruit, that I would probably have never been seen again. But what got even more terrifying after that was that after he left, he went outside, and there was still a payphone at the front of this service station at that point. And he was on the phone for a bit, and he was looking at me. And then he came back inside, and he came back to his car, this station wagon car, and he sat in his car just watching me for a bit then as well. And I was like, I was so scared. I ended up not actually hitting the road again that night. There was some motels attached to this because this is a real bush service station, sort of a satellite station on the way between cities. There's not a lot out there. And so I ended up staying in a motel overnight because I just had this visions that if I did hit the road, that I would see the headlights come up and this guy, grinning maniacally as he ran me off the road and took me to his lair. So yeah, I really worked up my imagination, and I think a lot of that ties into the stories surrounding the backpacker murderers of Australia. I mean, as a kid, Ivan Milat was sort of arrested as I was growing up, and he's a pretty renowned, a vile man who, the Bangalore Forest murders, he was kidnapping backpackers, murdering them out there. And so his arrest was probably as I was growing up in the 90s, and I'd seen a documentary not long before that was just terrifying, like the callousness of that man. And even when he died a couple of years ago, they're still like, we know there are more bodies, where are they? He's like, I'm never going to say anything. And then you also had the Joanne Lees case with Bradley Murdoch, which was not quite the same motivations as Milat, but also this kind of terrifying outback character patrolling the highways. And Joanne Lees managed to escape. They never found the body of Peter Falconio, the boyfriend at the time. There was a huge media thing. And this idea of this trope, and you see it in Wolf Creek as well, the Mick Taylor character, who's very much modeled on Ivan Milat. Just these terrifying Australian murderers that, it's pop culture at this point. And as opposed to the suave, sophisticated American serial killers, you see these Australian ones are really, salt of the earth, part of the land kind of people. And I wanted to write something like that because just that stuck with me, that story. Like even a few years later, after I'd sort of forgotten it or, come to terms with how it was all good, they actually talked about a house they found in that town where that happened, where there were bodies buried. And I mean, I called the cops. I was like, this guy. And they're like, oh, it's nothing like that. And I was just like, well, this dude's still out there somewhere, probably hassling strangers in service stations. He's probably a really nice guy, but in my head, he was a murderer. And yeah, he's probably going to see this one day and be like, oh, that was me. And I just wanted to talk to someone. But yeah, no, so that all bled into this. And I toured around with some short stories for a while. And then I was like, if this is just a backpacker murderer, it's just another one of those stories. Whereas if I can elevate that, add some of the creature feature elements and bring in that extra kind of level of horror, that would really allow me to bring in some of the really kind of horrific aspects of great horror, like the Fulci. You got like the faces melting and maggots and worms and all of that kind of really horrific kind of traditional, this is the graveyard rot kind of stuff. And so I tied the creature in with flies, and there's sentient sort of hive mind flies that swarm around, and I want some body horror in there. And so, yeah, it just escalates. So it comes from, here's a backpacker story to, oh my God, there's also these creatures, and oh my God, there's this thing, which is on the cover. So I don't have a paperback copy, unfortunately. So there's no surprise in what the monster is, but it's how it's operating. And that I just really wanted to elevate that story into a really full-on work of horror that was probably more brutal than anything I'd done before. So Yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, very much so. So, tell us about your main character. What's her personality like?
So Katie is really an innocent girl. She's the city girl in the story, and she's travelled out into the bush despite being warned. You know, like you need to be careful. And she'd meet people while she's backpacking, and they were like, you need to like be more sensible. You can't just go getting in every car. You can't be doing these things. And she just is a really good-natured soul who's like, yeah, well, that's just mythology. That's just rubbish. People are inherently good, and she goes out there to meet people. And even when she's hearing, because one of the things that we do have in the bush is there are really high suicide rates for young males in particular, and there's a lot of drift, a lot of the out of the city towns, the ones that are quite out there. The youth are moving to the cities because that's where work is, that's where education is, that's where opportunity is. And that's still happening. And she's kind of got this idea that people aren't disappearing, they're just leaving. And maybe they don't tell their parents, maybe life's tough out here, you know, maybe if we're living on farmland and it's too hard to, you know, survive because there's droughts or whatnot. People are just leaving. And so that's her. She really believes in the good of people and she wants to talk to people, and really good natured, really probably overly trusting, and ambitious, I guess. She wants to go out there and continue this idea of her grandfather's and write this manuscript into, maybe, like, I don't know if you ever saw the Humans of New York blog posts, that kind of thing, where her goal is to write these essays about the people she meets, talk about their stories, and this is who the people of the bush are. That's what she wants to do. So yeah. And there's another Kip is the male protagonist. I don't know if you want to hear about him or you were going to
Yeah.
ask about. Yeah. So Kip he's one of these guys who's leaving the bush. He's a very typical lad who lives out bush. He plays in punk bands, and he's, you know, his opportunities are limited. There's not a lot of work, and he's playing in these bands. One day, we have a radio station here, Triple J, and what they would do is every year they would have competitions where some small town gets a big festival, and they would send bands out there, and people would, you know, converge on the town for this. And he was able to get up on stage and play with these guys once, and they actually said, well, our guitarist is leaving. We need a new guitarist. So he's on his way to Brisbane, to the city, when he comes across Katie. And he's like, you shouldn't be out here alone. Like, there are people going missing. And she's like, yeah, sort of poo-poos it. And they're traveling together when they run into Pastroni, the antagonist of the story. So that's them.
All right. So, do any of your secondary characters steal the scenes?
Do either of my secondary characters steal the scenes?
Yeah.
I think it's done in a way where they kind of are trying to reunite on his camp. So once he takes them out there, things happen. So his goal is he's got to wait till the storms are coming enough. And they very much have their own diverging stories within the novella. And so I think Katie is a much stronger character than Kip, in that she sees the hope, whereas Kip is constantly berating himself that he could have done this, he could have done that, but he hasn't. And, you know, it's really, Katie is definitely the more heroic of the two. And I just think I always kind of want to feed into that trope of, you know, final girl kinds of things in horror, you know, and I think we've seen enough. Particularly, like, I read a lot of the old paperbacks, and it's always the bloke saving the day, you know, like, and, you know, he's got this submissive humor. I kind of like to subvert that a bit and just, yeah, have, you know, Katie be the one who's like fighting for her life, whereas Kip is like, oh no, what do we do, sort of thing. So yeah.
So what's the hardest part of writing horror fiction for you? Did any parts of the books give you trouble?
If you mean trouble as in writer's block, not particularly. I think this comes from just working in classrooms a lot, where you hear this, I've got writer's block, a lot from kids who don't want to do their work. But I really kind of believe that you can plan your way out of that, even if it is just laborious at times, even if your ideas aren't necessarily there, or you've got to fix something and you realize it's onerous. I really always, if I do kind of reach a point where I go, okay, well, what happens next? I'll always come back to my planning and a Freytag pyramid or a story curve and just, okay, well, what's going to build tension? What are the goals? What are they doing? How am I going to make this engaging? Because I really kind of want to turn pages when I'm reading, and I try to write like that as well. Obviously, everyone does. It's a really kind of mundane thing to say, but I like stories to move quickly, and I think that plotting on that Freytag story arc is a really great way to consider, okay, well, what happens? What's the cause and effect? How are they going to do this? So I try to write really focused with strong goals that I keep central to the characters. And even if it is something as simple as survival is the primary goal after the secondary goal of write this book or whatever, that's the focus. So anything the characters do has to be aligned with that, and therefore anything I write has to be aligned with those goals as well. So in terms of like, this book is probably more gruesome. Like, I always love blood and guts, but there are parts in this book where I was writing it and I was like, oh, is this okay? You know, like, is
Yeah.
this what I really want to put in there? And I consider it extreme horror, and a lot of people in reviews have called it extreme horror. But compared to some of the extreme horror I've read, I don't think it's anywhere on that level. It's certainly not sexually violent in that kind of way that I can't really deal with that in movies and things. I'm always just like, oh God, that's really super confronting. But there's definitely some gross parts of it. And probably part of that also comes, I used to write blog posts for Aussie Man Reviews, who's like a YouTuber. And sometimes I'd always get like really annoyed with the people who would send through the content to write, because there would be like pimple popping videos, or, oh, look at this. This is, what do they call it? I'm totally forgetting the name of it now, but it's where the bot flies and or they've laid like eggs in the gums and maggots in teeth and that kind of thing. And it's so gross. And so I find this really disturbing, and that will definitely give people a, ugh. And so I included some of that, and just having to sort of think about that and look at it and just be like, oh, why am I doing this? So there was that, because I'd always be like, man, will you please stop sending me pimple popping videos? I do not want to watch this just so I can write a 300-word blog post about it. And I swear they were just doing it deliberately by the end, because it was just, I think they knew that I didn't like it. So yeah, so that part of going as gruesome as I did was something I was like, oh, you know, you definitely like stories where, you know, someone might get a head chopped off or something, but, you know, like, as opposed to that aspect of body horror, that was, ooh. So yeah.
Okay, so without spoilers, what was your favorite scene in the book?
Oh, there's a really cool scene in the start, and I often think that when it comes time to sort of do readings, I think that this is the scene I might pick. There's a really intense scene in the service station where they meet Pastroni for the first time, and it leads into another scene where there's a chase. And it's really a riff on that experience I had, only I put two characters there, and he's way more intense. And because of the situation, Pastroni, the killer, he has these flies sort of surrounding him, and the tension over their table, like he's like taking food from their plates and this kind of thing, and just talking to them. And then they eventually annoy him, and then his anger kicks into gear. And that scene, like, when just reading it back, I'm just like, yeah, that's a really effective scene, even as a short story in its own, you know, like the escalation of tension in there before it dies down and they get on the road again, and that. So yeah, that's early in the book, but that was a really cool scene to write, in terms of what dialogue's going on there. How will people be reacting if they had this imposing, smelly figure being really in their face about things and questioning them? So yeah.
Okay, so what do you think readers will enjoy about the book? What would you want them to take away from it?
I think with any book I write, I just want people to say it had that that fast factor of the tension. I just wanted to turn the page. What I have enjoyed people pointing out is, I think there are a bit of the egotistical kind of things, where, I don't know if you've ever read the George Orwell's Why I Write essay, but he talks about, you know, part of it is just saying to people that, look, I'm actually a skilled writer, even when it is a pulp story at its heart, like being able to put sentences together in a nice way. Or so your English teacher at school could see that and be like, oh, okay, like, I really didn't like, I think, that kid, because I had this one English teacher as his, I remember she wouldn't mark my assignment. She put a big red line through it and said, "This is gratuitously violent. I refuse to mark it." And yeah, and I was just like, but it's literally just, soldiers. It's a typical teenage boy story, but yeah, she refused to mark it. And now whenever I write a story that's like got lots of extreme violence in it, I always just think I should send one to her in the mail. I don't know where she is, poor lady. But yeah, and as a teacher myself, I think about that, and I think about, yeah, so I'll go back to the question. I'm sidetracking. Sorry, I do that. But the question is, what do I like? That it's well written, but also that it is just this intense ride you go on, and that's all I think. Like, there's nothing better than when you're reading a book or watching a movie, and you're just there. You're just so invested in it that you just, okay, wow, that's actually finished now, and I can come up for air and just be like, whew, that just happened. That was a thing that happened, and I want that kind of immersive full body experience from something I write, and hopefully people get that out of it. I'd be stoked if they got that out of it. So, yeah.
Okay, so what do you like to do when you're not writing? Do you have any hobbies or hidden talents?
I'm an English teacher, and so is my wife. So we mark a lot of assignments in our yeah. No, look, we watch a lot of movies. We hang out a lot. We have our cats here who we get great joy out of. Who both are just ignoring me right now. They were fighting this morning, so now they're sitting close to each other without actually looking at each other. But no, we just hang out a lot together. My wife and I, we play tennis, we go for walks, we go to movies. Like last night, we went and saw Con Air at the cinema, which they were playing the original 70mm film at a local cinema. So that was really cool to go and see. Yeah, those things, we're thinking today we might go and play some darts in an overpriced darts hall. So, yeah, those kind of things. Just regular family stuff, I think. And
It's
yeah,
always fun to have a good game of darts. So,
yeah.
what's your next project? What's the future hold for you?
Well, in September, my debut novel is coming out, Polyphemus. So that's really exciting. It's the longest thing I've written by a long way. I've only had novellas to this point, and to have a novel coming out is really cool. I have another novella on submission. I've started a new novel, which is probably a bit more YA in terms of its characters and its overall goal. And that probably won't be so creature featurey. I am going for that more of a haunting kind of vibe with that one. And just bringing in, I'm a big advocate that we should write what we love. And I often think when I see write what you know, and I know this is talked about a lot too, I think people misunderstand that as something you actually have in-depth knowledge about, as opposed to what you're passionate about, what you care about. And that's why so I think here, like my wife, her family are Romanian. So when we traveled there, we got this really awesome mask, and I want to use that in the story and imagine what that would be like. And so it's got that haunted object vibe, plus bringing it to young teenage characters dealing with it themselves, but without really holding back on the horrific elements of the story. Because I know that in class, if the kids, when it comes to story, are always so much more engaged. If even something like The Monkey's Paw, like they love that. If you can give kids spooky stuff or teenagers spooky stuff, they absolutely love it. And so I kind of want to write something that when the kids in class say, "Have you got anything we can read?" Because I'm like, do not read this book. Your parents will call the school. They'll call the police. Like, don't do that. And so something I can go, yeah, actually, you can read this. So that's something I'm probably about 15,000 words into, and already know there's huge parts of rewriting to happen. But so working on that would be, hopefully getting that done would be really cool. So yeah.
Okay, well, that sounds like something to look forward to. So we'll wrap the interview up here, and I'd like to thank you for being a guest today. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much. Yeah, great. Thank you.
And you can tell the audience where they can find you and your books.
Yeah, sure. Just look, there's a whole multitude of social media sites that happened over the last few weeks. I did get on Threads. I couldn't get an invite to Blue Sky. So I've got Threads. I've got Twitter. There's a TikTok. There's an Instagram. If you just look up Zachary Ashford, you'll find me. If you've got other authors that you follow, you'll probably see that I've got links in there. If you are in the Brisbane area, occasionally we get to do readings and cool things like that. Hopefully we'll do a launch for this in one of the local areas soon, maybe a bit of a reading and things. But yeah, just you'll find me on social media. And I have a website, zacharyashford.com, and you can get links and things there too. So yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. And that's it for this episode of Authors Interviews at Crystal Lake. And bye for now.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.